Dream of the Red Chamber is a great literary masterpiece, and it's also a pretty bad romance novel. It commits the cardinal sin of romance writing. That sin, of course, is killing off the character that the readers care about the most. Lin Daiyu is clearly doomed to die from the beginning, though only the most perceptive readers will get it the first time through. And it's also clear from the early poetry that Shui Baochai is not going to have a happy life either. Now, the absolute worst thing you can do when you're writing a romance book is to write a sad ending, right? Nobody wants to invest hours in your story and in finding out about your world, only to discover that their favorite characters wind up miserable in the end, or even worse, dead. And as surprising as it might seem, this was also the mentality of Chinese readers back in the 18th century. Now, the equivalent of a romance novel in China in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties was the caizi jiaren genre. These were typically novels involving a romance between a young scholar, that's the caizi, and a beautiful girl, who is the jiaren. What I know about them comes originally from this 1994 book called Huaben Yu Caizi Jiaren Xiaoshuozhi Yanzhou. This book was quoted pretty heavily in The Fragile Scholar, a 2004 study on masculinity by a scholar named Song Geng. And ultimately, I found this citation through Wikipedia, which goes to show that your teachers were wrong. Wikipedia actually can be a really good place to find academic sources, though you do still need to do the work yourself. Anyway, Song Geng quotes the Chinese book extensively here as he describes the elements of a caizi jiaren story. First, it's got to be a love story between a handsome young scholar and a beautiful girl, and they just so happen to be both gifted in prose and poetry. Now, modern Western romance might not have the prose and poetry bit, but it absolutely requires attractive characters. And it makes sense, right? You know, my wife always complains if I want to watch a movie with her that has characters that she considers to be unattractive. Well, if you're reading a long book specifically for the romance, you want the characters to be attractive, right? And naturally, this is true of Dream of the Red Chamber. In television and movies, Zhao Baoyu is often depicted as a somewhat childish and effeminate young man. In the book, however, he is described with a natural spark and attractive charm that shines out through his somewhat immature appearance. Of course, Lin Daiyu is always portrayed as drop-dead gorgeous, and the same is true of Shui Baochai. And so it's obvious that Dream of the Red Chamber is a love story involving three very attractive people, just as the formula dictates. And then you get their exceptional gifts for poetry and prose, which are more present in Dream of the Red Chamber than in any other book. But we haven't gotten far enough yet to see any of that. I mean, I just finished translating chapter 5 the other day. It's going to take a little while to get to the real meat of the poetry, but it's coming. The second requirement is that the hero and the heroine come from distinguished families. While this is not necessarily a requirement in modern romance, you see it pretty frequently. The same principle that applied to attractiveness applies here. You want characters that do something interesting, not somebody who does nothing. Now, in Dream of the Red Chamber, the truth is that practically nobody in the Jia family knows how to actually make money. But the family is still quite distinguished. And both Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai come from distinguished families, though they're clearly not as materially well off as Zhao Baoyu. Then comes the trope that somebody's parent must be deceased, mostly to help distinguish the characters. Lin Daiyu's mother is dead, which is the whole reason her father sent her to be with the Jia family in the first place. Meanwhile, Shui Baochai's father died when she was really young, and her influential family is now controlled by her brutish and violent brother Shui Pan. Now, you'll notice as we go through this list that every single point that clearly applies to Lin Daiyu also clearly applies to Shui Baochai, and there's a good reason for that. The third requirement is that they fall in love with each other at first sight. Lin Daiyu expects that Zhao Baoyu will be a hoodlum, and yet he turns out to be quite attractive. Zhao Baoyu is so smitten with Lin Daiyu that she is portrayed in a poem as being the most beautiful woman in Chinese history. While we don't see how Zhao Baoyu and Shui Baochai meet, we learn about it because of the impact it has on the budding romance between Zhao Baoyu and Lin Daiyu. And Shui Baochai seems to be everything that Lin Daiyu is not. She is tactful, kind, courteous, generous, and refined. And now we're going to get to some of the tropes of Chinese romantic fiction that we haven't seen in the book yet, but that we're going to need to look out for. Fourth is the hindrances that get in the way of the marriage. Usually this is because the scholar doesn't have any official rank when they first meet. Now, Jia Baoyu not only has no official rank, but he also absolutely detests studying for the imperial exams. And interestingly enough, the biggest hindrance that comes between Jia Baoyu and both of the girls is the existence of the other girl. Well, I guess it's a classic love triangle, and the existence of this love triangle has also given way to some pretty ridiculous interpretations. So for example, the famous sinologist David Hawkes concluded that Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai must both be two sides of the perfect woman. This is an interpretation I find absolutely bizarre, and I really need to explain why. Okay, near the end of Jia Baoyu's dream in chapter 5, the goddess who unveils illusion presents Jia Baoyu with a spiritual maiden who combines the best features of both Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai. This girl is named Zhenmei, which literally means combining both beauties, and the goddess tells him to consummate his marriage with her. And so Jia Baoyu does what he is told, and before long he wakes up from his dream. Now, David Hawkes in his commentary notes that Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai seem to complement one another. One is all the things that the other is not. And so he concludes that they must be two sides of the ideal woman, who I guess is Zhenmei. This is as if the author took his perception of the perfect girl and somehow split her in half. But the problem here is that this oversimplifies what both Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai represent. So let me explain briefly. Shui Baochai is the ultimate Confucian woman, one who cares a lot about interpersonal relationships, hierarchies, and moving up in the world. While a lot of the proof for this is yet to come, we've already seen it in one of the poems in chapter 5. This famous poem, Regret at the End of Life, is a regret written by a much older Jia Baoyu that his romance with Lin Daiyu was fated to end. The final line here is very difficult to translate. Even though we respect each other, my heart has no peace in the end. In Chinese, the line is 纵然是寂美久安，到底意难平. The key phrase is this one, 寂美久安. This refers to a classical story involving a young couple and Confucian respect shown from wife to husband. In this old story, the woman would prepare a meal for her husband, place it on a tray for him, and raise it to the level of her eyebrows as a sign of deep respect and devotion. That might seem bizarre by modern standards, but it's used here as a representation of Shui Baochai and her formal and heavily Confucian relationship with Jia Baoyu. Now look at that line again. 纵然 means even though or although. So, even though there's this constant Confucian respect from the wife to the husband, still, in the end, he can find no peace. Of course, that all leads us to wonder what Lin Daiyu really represents. Is she a symbol of Taoism, or is something else going on? Honestly, I don't think we've read enough to know for sure. However, check out what Jia Baoyu saw when he first encountered Lin Daiyu. This phrase is key. 一双似喜非喜憨情目. He sees a pair of qing eyes that are neither happy nor sad. Now, qing here probably means emotion-filled. In other words, these are eyes filled with real meaning, but that don't betray either happiness or sadness. In other words, Shui Baochai represents Confucianism. This is Jia Baoyu's formal duty to his family, his ancestors, and his posterity. But Lin Daiyu represents his true heart, his emotions and feelings, those things that the world keeps telling him to suppress. Or, to put it bluntly, it's not that Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai are two halves of some mythical perfect woman. Rather, they represent Jia Baoyu's internal struggle between his duty, what he has to do, and his heart, what he wants to do. And so the hindrances that come in Jia Baoyu's way are mostly internal, something that's pretty odd for a romance novel. Next comes the clever girl servant who works as mediator and a matchmaker. There's a ton of this in Dream of the Red Chamber, though we haven't quite gotten that far yet. As we work through the book, though, just remember that the maids tend to act as stand-ins for the people that they serve. Actually, in a sense, you could argue that every single character in the Jia family is trying to make a match between Jia Baoyu and either Lin Daiyu or Shui Baochai. And then you've got the final point that the love story usually ends happily. Now, in a modern romance, you have to have a happily ever after ending, or at least happily for now. As this anonymous Redditor correctly explains, it's simply not romance if there isn't a happily ever after ending. It's got to be a different kind of book. And so it's clear that Dream of the Red Chamber is not a romance novel, or a才子佳人novel for that matter. It doesn't end happily. But the point here is that it uses the well-established genre as a literary tool. This book reads a lot like a romance novel or like a才子佳人novel, to the point where the readers kind of expected what was going to happen. And as you can imagine, people were outraged when their expectations were not met by the ending. So, as the University of Minnesota correctly tells us, the ending made people so upset that others have rewritten the ending to suit their own imaginations. And so you get works of fan fiction like this continuation of Dream of the Red Chamber. And you've also got the large works by dissatisfied scholars, most of whom accuse Gawa of ruining the novel by miswriting the final 40 chapters. Now, admittedly, not all of these arguments come simply because the expected romantic ending is not there. And, maybe the scholars are right. We're not going to know that for sure until we've gotten much further into the book and we've really dug in deeply. But you have to admit that the way that Dream of the Red Chamber was written, and especially finished, has really brought out some interesting emotions in the people who've read it and studied it. Interestingly enough, it's also not the first work to subvert the 才子佳人 genre of romance. 西厢记, or Romance of the Western Chamber, is a well-known play that was written and published centuries before Dream of the Red Chamber was written. This story is all about a secret love affair between a handsome scholar and a beautiful woman. Now, the controversy with this book is that the lovers had a secret union before they were married, something that was really scandalous at the time. In fact, during the Qing dynasty, Romance of the Western Chamber was banned, which becomes interesting since Jia Baoyu is described as being caught reading it by Lin Daiyu later in Dream of the Red Chamber. And you can think of Dream of the Red Chamber as kind of an extension of the ideas in Romance of the Western Chamber, but there's actually a dark side as well. For example, we already saw how Jia Baoyu winds up consummating his imaginary marriage with both Lin Daiyu and Shui Baochai at the same time in his dream. However, in real life, Jia Baoyu's first physical experience with a girl comes with his maid, Hua Xiren, and not either of the girls that he's in love with. And there is a heavy implication here that there was no consent in this arrangement. Now, that's absolutely not the sort of thing that you would see in any sort of idealized romance novel or in a才子佳人book. I guess on the one hand you could say that Jia Baoyu is a product of his environment. I mean, he grows up surrounded by gorgeous women and can do pretty much whatever he wants. But this is still extremely unsettling. He's no hero, that's for certain. Anyway, the long story short here is that Dream of the Red Chamber is actually a great example of how not to write romance. There are great romantic elements to the story, sure, but the ending is sad and has left readers feeling unfulfilled for centuries. The truth is that it is far darker and much more psychological than most readers are willing to admit. And in my mind, that's what makes this book so fascinating. The best way to read it is to think about the reasons why the characters are doing what they're doing, especially if they're doing something that you consider strange. And you've also got to realize that the romantic elements are largely emulating the romantic fiction formula, that才子佳人formula. And then the author has deliberately taken those elements and turned them on their head.